Good afternoon and welcome to June's edition of the live Q&A for the Never Taught to Lift podcast. So my name is Chris Tiley. I am a physiotherapist and I've got a particular interest in introducing strength training to older adults. I am looking to answer your questions that you might have on strength training pretty much at the beginner stages. So if you've never started or are interested in started but a little bit fearful, or you have started but you aren't seeing the progress that you were looking for, then I want to invite you to answer any or ask me any questions that you might have. So I've had a lot of questions come in by email this week. So we've got 7 questions that I've already lined up, and we're going to be talking everything from lifting weights with hip replacements, difference between muscle power and muscle strength, and whether we need to worry about power, and if we do, how we go about building or improving muscle power. Then we can go into things like lifting weights with varicose veins and whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. And as I said, we've got more questions from there. I also want to invite you to ask me any questions live. So if you are watching this live and you have a question for me, you can use the chat feature and just ask me there. I can bring that question up on screen and I will do my best to answer that. If it's something I feel I need a bit more time to research to give you the best answer possible, then I will come back to that in another Q&A session, but I'll acknowledge the question and then we can come back into that for next month's Q&A. Now, you might be watching this on YouTube later on in the day or later on in the week. Leave a comment underneath the video with the question, or you can send me an email at chris@nevertoldtolift.com. And again, I'll come back to that in next month. In the Q&A. And if you are listening to this on the audio podcast, so all the audio from this will go out to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever podcast player you might be listening to this on. Then again, if you do have any questions for me, please do send an email. So it's chris@nevertoldtolift.com. Bit of a disclaimer before I get started. Any questions I've had in are very sort of general questions, sort of the context they've given. I've had a little more context than just the question alone that I'm going to put up in a second. But I haven't had a lot of detail in. Again, as a physio, I haven't been able to ask any questions back. So please don't consider any of what I say as personalised medical advice. This is more for informational, educational purposes. If you do have any injuries you are concerned about, then please do go and seek out help from the relevant medical professional, whether it's GP, physiotherapist, etc. And then before we go into that first question, if you are in those early stages of strength training or you haven't got started yet and you want a little bit more support and a bit more of a framework to follow, then you might be interested in listening to or watching the Masterclass that I've put on. So it's a pre-recorded video about an hour long, and to guide you through all the theory you might need to know, some of the exercises you might want to include in your strength program, and just how you might modify and adapt those around your individual needs. Then you can go to nevertoldtolift.com/masterclass, or if you're watching this on YouTube, that link is in the description below, or you'll find that on the show notes of the podcast. It's nevertoldtolift.com podcast 008, and you'll find all the links that I'm talking about today in there. But for now, let's get started with that first question. So the first question I had was, is lifting weights a good idea for someone who's had both hips replaced? So the short answer is yes, it's a fantastic idea. A couple of reasons. The first reason is that increasing the muscle strength throughout our legs primarily is going to create a nice, smooth, efficient suspension system for all those legs. And if the muscle strength and that suspension system is absorbing the impacts from walking, potentially a bit of running or any sports you might be doing, the more force that we absorb through the muscles, the less of that is going to get through to the joints and some of the other what we call inert structures that don't have the ability to absorb like muscles do. So if we're weaker and we fatigue, what our muscles often tend to do is stiffen to try and create stability. And a stiff muscle doesn't really have the ability to absorb very well. So now we have excess force that's still there from the muscles not absorbing it. So that is just going to get transferred through to the joint and can start to just cause excess force, and that culmination of force over time can cause potentially problems later on down the line. So that's whether you've not had hip replacements, that's whether you've got arthritis, mild or severe, or whether you've gone on to have both hips replaced. If we're not looking at building strength, just like anywhere else, we are going to be losing strength if we're not trying to specifically target it. So the more strength we have, the less of a problem we like to have. The other reason that strength training is good, because it builds a kind of tolerance up in the hip as well. So the more tolerance we have to higher levels of stress, the less likely we are going to experience pain in some of the other muscles or joints around that hip. If you've had your hips replaced, there's a good chance that if you try and start a strength training program in the same way as you might have done in your 20s or 30s, or someone else in their 20s or 30s might do now, you might be more prone to some kind of reaction where you have pain in and around that hip. So we do want to make sure we start very slowly and gradually build up again, rather than sort of jumping straight in like you might have done. Again, I don't know how recently this person's had their hips replaced. If one of them was done quite recently, then obviously we have to go through the post-operative pain first and the healing of the scar and the incision, and build some basic strength first before we might add weights into the program. But actually quite quickly you can add weights in, and we just need to be guided by the thing that is the limiting factor in that. So again, whether it's the actual acute post-operative pain, then there's no point trying to push through too early, because that's going to hold us back. If you're a little bit further down the line, everything's kind of settled for the day-to-day activities, but you're just nervous about starting, then again, it's just a slow progression through getting confident with the exercises first, adding a little bit of weight, and then gradually increasing that weight till we can get the movement patterns that we're trying to do. We're trying to push those close to that muscular fatigue where the last repetition is the last one you could have done. And it's just being mindful that we might have some reactions at times that we're trying to work on. But yeah, definitely lifting weights is very beneficial for someone to have both hips replaced. Also, thinking back to someone who might be in that arthritic stage, their pain's quite acute, they've had it for a while, they've talked or had it mentioned that they might need their hips or a hip or both hips replaced in the future. It's still worth starting the strength training process before you have the surgery. Now, this might be difficult because of certain movements that are going to be painful to do. Every exercise and movement pattern can be modified and adapted, whether it's going down to a shallower height, whether we do it in a fixed machine rather than, say, a squat or a deadlift. We want to try and find something that we can start to build a bit of strength in the muscle, and sometimes that actually starts to reduce the pain. Because it's important to know that the amount of arthritis you have, so the amount the cartilage has been affected, doesn't necessarily correlate with the amount of pain you're in. And I've seen it several times where someone's had real bad pain in one hip but not in the other. They've had both hips x-rayed, and the one that's painful actually looks quite good. It's the arthritis is fairly mild and early, whereas the non-painful one, the one that's pain-free, that is the one that actually on x-ray looks like it should be the painful one. It's quite advanced, the arthritis, it's closer to that kind of bone on bone, yet it's not painful, where the other one is, and that looked quite good. So often arthritis means you might be more prone to a flare-up of pain than someone who doesn't have the arthritis. But often it can be a flare-up that can calm down again. And often strength training is something that will help calm it down. So you might even find that by doing the strength training, although you were nervous about it making it worse, it actually improves as a result. If it doesn't, and you still have to go and have the surgery, starting the process of strength training and increasing the strength a little bit, the more strength you've got going into surgery, the better the outcomes tend to be. So it's never a lost cause or waste of time by starting beforehand. It's just going to help you after the fact. So that's something else worth noting there. But yeah, hopefully that's helped. The same person actually had a question on what are the typical injuries sustained whilst lifting weights? How can I avoid them? So the ones I tend to see people complain of pain as a result of lifting weights tends to be, the most common is back, and it tends to be during deadlift. And I've been there myself and done it myself, where I've just gone a little bit too much too soon and felt something, sort of a tweak in my back, and then suffered for a few days or a few weeks afterwards until I felt comfortable to kind of reintroduce the weights and get back to it. So backs tends to be one of them. Shoulders is another common one. Knee pain during squats, or just kind of moving awkwardly in squat and suddenly having knee pain can be quite common. The thing to note with all of these, that sudden pain during an exercise doesn't necessarily mean you've suddenly gone and damaged anything. All it means is you've made something very angry and sensitive. In some some cases, but it tends to be on a very low percentage, there might be something that has damaged itself, whether you've torn something or something along those lines. But again, most of the time it is just something that's become acutely sensitive that we just need time to calm down and then gradually start going through the process of getting confident with the movement pattern again, adding a bit of weight, seeing how it reacts, and we can build back up again. So a lot of people who have tweaked their backs once during a deadlift vow never to do a deadlift again, and they just work on all the other movement patterns, and they're then leaving their back vulnerable because that's an important movement pattern. That hip hinge movement pattern is very important. And if we're leaving it out because of the fear of pain, we're actually creating an environment where at some point you're going to need to lift that plant pot in the garden or lift the suitcase from the floor into the boot of the car. And if you've done nothing to prepare your back for that, then that's where you might tweak it again. So we do need to take these steps out of comfort zone, and the comfort zone is going to be a lot lower because of that fear on that recent episode of back pain. But yeah, that's one that we might want to think about. Same with the shoulder. Often people think, they do a little bit of Googling and think, oh, I must have torn my rotator cuff. And often it's not torn, it's just aggravated and sensitive. And we need to take a little bit of time, calm things down, and then reintroduce those movement patterns that it didn't like. Same with the knees. But yeah, so how can I avoid them is, I mentioned earlier, the time I've suffered with it is when I have done too much too soon, and I haven't given my body time to adapt and adapt positively to the ever increasing weight that I'm doing. So if you are getting started with exercise, particularly if you're doing it later on in life, we do need to take very slow progressions, but the progressions still need to be there in order to be able to get back up to those higher levels of weights. It could be that you start off by doing things in like a fixed weights machine. So rather than doing squats or deadlifts, you might start to do things like leg press, or you can do things like knee extension or hamstring curls. And because you're in a more supported environment, the machine guides your movement through sort of one plane of movement, and you're not less likely to have a little wobble as you lose your balance. Then we're less likely to put a stress on those smaller structures that might cause a bit of a reaction where everything unlocks into this kind of protective spasm around the back or tweaks the knee. So starting with the fixed machines tends to be a good option for a lot of people. It does mean you have to go to the gym, but then actually progressing so you can get to the point where you can do exercises like squats is better in my eyes, because you combine it with a balance. You learn how to sort of change and adapt and do that whilst you're pushing the strength at the same time. So it's not to say that the fixed machine should be forever, but that could be an option to get started. But as a general guide, the best way to avoid injuries is start progressing your exercises gently and and only make small increases at a time. Don't take these big jumps that you might have got away with in the past. Then we come on to the next question. What is the difference between muscle strength and power, and how do I increase muscle power? So this came off the back of them reading an article in, I think it was The Guardian, that talked about the importance of muscle power as we get older, and not just to think about muscle strength. I haven't had a chance to read that article yet, but wanted to kind of go on to answer their questions, which were about what is the difference between strength and power. And muscle strength is that ability of the muscle to produce a peak force in one contraction. So it's how much force can that muscle generate in one contraction. Muscle power is how quickly can that muscle produce that power. So it's less about the total power, it's the speed at which it can contract and produce that power. So commonly it's measured in things like jump height or jump distance. You need all your muscles to produce that power really quickly to create enough momentum to get you off the floor and propelled forward or just propelled upwards. It's if you're just strong and you can't access that muscle strength very quickly, you're not going to get very high. So it's important that we try and work on both. And I agree with what seemed to be the premise of the article, that we want to look at muscle power as well as muscle strength. And anyone who's listened to me a lot, I haven't really talked about muscle power that much. And I'm just going to talk through my take on where I'd bring that in. So another kind of a couple of examples first of how that's important of having that muscle power. So a nice example I heard once is if you are walking and you trip, or if you're walking into a room, you catch your toe on the rug, your then momentum of your body moving forwards is still happening, but your foot is now behind you and behind where it needs to be. So you need to quickly get that foot back in place. But not only that, once it's in place, you've created more momentum. So you're having to now absorb more force in a shorter period of time to stop you from actually ending up on the floor and falling. There's a lot of people who manage to get their foot back in place in time, but by that point there's so much excess force from the increased momentum and the speed at which you're falling forwards that the leg doesn't have that strength, or it doesn't have the ability to access that strength quickly enough to break it, and they've ended up on the floor, or they never managed to get their foot in place in the first place. And the increased muscle power can be just as crucial for, say, avoiding falls than building muscle strength alone. Problem is, if you're spending then all your time working on your muscle power without having built any strength in the first place, if you haven't got any decent level of strength, you haven't got the strength to be able to produce quickly. So if you've only got a little bit of strength, accessing that quickly isn't as helpful as actually building more strength in the first place. And then once we've built it, then we can go about trying to access it quicker. That's my take on it. So I tend to get people confident first with the strength-based exercises. So what are the exercises first? What's the intensity you need to be able to do that at to actually build strength? And then once we've got that, then we can add in those muscle power-based exercises where we're trying to increase the speed at which you're able to access that strength. There are some people that do both at the same time. I tend to feel that if you're someone who is starting later in life, you've never been particularly interested in strength training or resistance training, taking too many steps out your comfort zone at one time and trying to learn everything all at once is quite overwhelming, and you're more likely to give up with it. So I'd rather you kind of focus on one part for me, which is the strength part first, and then we can add some of the power-based exercises in. So I normally say kind of maybe 10, 12 weeks in, we might start introducing some of those exercises. So what are the exercises? Often they actually look very similar to the exercises we're currently doing. So what we want to practice doing is the same type of exercises and movement patterns with more intent, with more speed. And often what we can do, so we might be doing a squat where we sit down to a chair or a box or bench and then come back up again. And we might do that with a weight. But what we can start to do is maybe slowly on the way down and explosively drive up. Not so much that you jump at the end of it, but you might even come up onto your toes and then slowly come down, and you're going to see how quickly you can explode back up again. That's one example. We could get rid of the weights initially and actually do some jump-based training. So you might try and see how high you can jump. You might even try and jump up onto something, so commonly referred to as box jumps, because there's people that try and jump up onto the big boxes. But initially, that can be quite dangerous if you haven't done any jump-based work and you're trying to get up onto something. If you are trying to get up onto it and you catch your toe, we have that same thing as you'll suddenly catch your toe. You aren't going to move your legs forward quick enough and you end up having too much forward momentum. And now you've got something in your way, or you're doing it from a height. So it can be quite dangerous initially. So what I do with some people is initially see whether you can actually clear the floor. So just jumping up and down on the spot, and then jumping over a line. So I might just put either a small bit of tape on the floor, or just draw with a bit of chalk, and you're then trying to jump over that line. Then I might put a mat on the floor, so it's literally kind of half an inch you're trying to jump up onto. Then you can actually use weight plates, so you can then jump onto the weight plate, step back off, jump back on again. Then you can use a step and then potentially go onto a box or something similar. And then I often put another surface in front of them. So it might be my raised plinth in the clinic, or I use another box on its taller side up, so that if you do catch your foot, you've got your hand supported on something and catch your weight straight away rather than falling onto the floor. So there's ways to make the environment a lot safer around you to add in the jump training. But jump training can be really useful because, again, that's how quickly can I move my feet, and that might help with that stumbling if you were to catch your foot when you're walking and start to trip. The other exercise is a lot of people use things like kettlebell swings. So you can do a thing where your arms almost end up between your legs and you bend your hips and then you drive your hips forwards to create enough momentum to swing that kettlebell up to the arms, either kind of horizontal or even always further up above the head. And then that arm comes down again. You're breaking the momentum of that with your hips as they bend in, and then as you then extend them forwards, you're trying to create that explosive power to create the swing to lift the kettlebell. It's not just the arms lifting up and down. It's very much a hip hinge exercise that we talked about, where you're trying to create that muscle power or access that muscle strength really quickly to create that explosive movement. And then a bit further on down the line, you see people do these cleans and snatch type exercises. So clean is where the bar is on the floor. You're then trying to drive up very quickly, create enough momentum to get the bar up into the air, drop your body down to get underneath and catch that bar on your chest. And again, that needs to be done very quickly to have the momentum to kind of create that weightlessness of the bar, to get underneath it quickly and catch it in that almost squatted position before you then come back up again. And then a snatch is even more explosive than that. The bar is on the floor and you see how quickly you can lift it up to try and get up and catch it already above your head. So your arms are kind of locked out above your head. They're quite advanced, particularly the snatch. I don't really do that with any of the people that I work with. Cleans, I do come on to some of the ones that have been doing it for a while and a bit more advanced. But they're all idea of power-based exercises. But the very simple ones you can do is the exercise you're already doing is, once you feel like you're confident with it, you're confident pushing to fatigue, and you've been doing it for a while, then start to experiment with the speed at which you do that. Just add, the intent is a really nice word, is do that exercise with intent to just really get up quickly, whether it's from the squat. You can even do it from, say, shoulder press. You can explode up, slowly come down. Same with bench press. Any exercise you can add speed in to practice doing it quickly so that our muscles learn how to access that strength quickly. So as a reminder, if you are watching this live and you have any questions, then feel free to put those in the chat. And if you have any questions, if you're watching this afterwards, please do use a comment or send me an email. It's chris@nevertaughttolive.com. Is that David or David says good morning? So yeah, good morning. So yeah, if you are watching live, then do leave a little message to sort of introduce yourself and say where you're from. I'm always interested to find out. In the meantime, let's go on to the next question. Is lifting weights good or bad for varicose veins? Now, I'm going to admit this isn't something that I've really looked into much before. As a physio, people don't tend to come in to see me for symptoms of varicose veins. So it's never something I've kind of put too much research or time into looking into. So that's kind of back to the disclaimer at the start of anything I say is more for informational purposes, and you might need a bit more research into this or seek out another relevant medical profession. But I've done a little bit of research into it this morning, and from what I found, I'm going to sort of give my take on what I think about lifting weights with varicose veins. So there seems to be a bit of a myth that lifting weights with varicose veins is bad for them. And so, or it's more that exercise with weights is bad for them. So people tend to avoid exercise because they're worried about inflaming their veins or making the pain worse. And often there's a natural thing that happens when you exercise where your veins get slightly pushed towards the surface of the skin that makes them appear like they're bulging more, or because they're more visible. And people kind of, particularly if you've got varicose veins, seem to see that as an idea that they might be getting inflamed and therefore it's a bad thing and not to do it. But actually it's a process that happens in all veins. It's because they're darker and discoloured that you just notice it more. And actually the evidence seems to support that exercise is actually better for the veins, because particularly if we're moving our legs, we are creating almost like a better pump system for the legs to support the return of the blood to the body. And so that pressure from the muscles helps to move that blood, particularly when we've got damage to those valves in the veins, then that is particularly helpful. But there also seems to be a consensus that lifting heavy weights can increase the pressure and therefore potentially damage the valves further and cause more of a problem. Now, it should be noted that it refers to heavy lifting or lifting heavy weights. So we need to kind of think, what does heavy mean in that situation? And often they're talking about people who were already lifting weights and they were doing it to a high level, and it's that really heavy side of things that is a problem. But heavy for you might be completely different for someone else. So we then also need to look at the other benefits of lifting weights and the adverse effect of losing muscle strength. So losing muscle strength as we get older can leave us, or is often associated with things like dementia, diabetes, cardiac disease, respiratory disease. It's increased risk of falls, and those falls can cause some problems or fractures. And sometimes we then have to weigh up if we're avoiding lifting weights because we are fearful of making the varicose veins a bit more painful and slightly worse. What's the sort of worst of two evils? Are we then leaving ourselves more prone to everything else? And actually by building some strength, can we avoid everything else and then risk the varicose veins getting worse? So we have to kind of weigh that up a little bit. So it's a bold call not to do any strength work, knowing that it could have so many other adverse reactions. But we can still build strength without the need to lift really heavy. So this is a bit like with anything. So whether someone's talking about back pain, whether they're talking about varicose veins, whether they're talking about chronic fatigue, there's often something that limits you that someone that's starting in their 20s wouldn't have to think about. And we have to be guided by the pace of that rather than what we might actually have the muscle strength for. So comes back to that whole taking things slow at the start and gradually progressing. So I would say that you want to start off just getting used to the exercises first and doing those with no weights. And actually, just by going through the motions, we can start to feel a lot stronger because our brain is learning the most efficient way of using the muscle strength we already have. So that in itself can actually build some strength. The muscles themselves aren't actually building in size, but we can actually see some positive outcomes in how much muscles or that force that we can produce from our muscles. Then we can start to add a little bit of weight to that. And again, at this stage, we don't necessarily have to push to muscular fatigue yet. We can keep things really light, make sure we get confident with it, check there's no adverse reaction. If there's no adverse reaction, let's see if we can push to muscular fatigue around 15 repetitions. And if we push to muscular fatigue at 15 repetitions, we are using a much lighter weight than if we were doing it, say, within 5 repetitions. And then for most people, I generally try and encourage people to increase the weight further so they bring the fatigue point down closer to 5 repetitions. But given that we know that heavy weights potentially is not good for varicose veins, it might be that if you are suffering from varicose veins, you only ever work at that kind of maybe 10 to 15 repetition mark, knowing that, yes, if you pushed a bit harder or lift a bit heavier, you might increase your strength at a faster rate if you got down to 5 repetitions. But you're still getting stronger if you get to fatigue within 10 to 15 repetitions. And that might be a better option for you. So that's kind of my take on that. Like I say, I'm no expert at all on varicose veins and the research behind it, so you might need to look again. I have put a link to an article in the description below, along with a lot of other articles for some of the other questions that I found relevant. So it might be having a worth looking through there. And if you're ever just not sure, then again, seeking out help from a medical professional is a better option there. So hopefully that's helped. Notice a bit of movement in the chat, so let's go back. So David says, I'm 50-year-old man from Italy. 1 year ago, I was in a bad situation, being 114 kilograms. Started dieting and now 77 kilograms, training regularly for about 8 months. I'm struggling with bilateral arthrosis of the hips, but exercise and weight loss made a huge difference. Are there any suggestions to prefer to avoid considering my hip condition? The big movement patterns I tend to concentrate on for the legs in general are squats, deadlifts, and lunges. And then for some people, I might bring in some lateral based movements where we're working maybe against a resistance band or cable machine. But, and again, without knowing more, if you can tolerate the squats, and it might be you just don't go down to the full depth squats, you just work on more shallow squats and work with heavier weights in a shallow squat, and that might be sufficient for you to build the strength. Again, deadlifts, instead of doing a deadlift from the floor, you might work on a Romanian deadlift or what we call a rack pull, where the bar starts lifted up on the hooks, and then you're just lifting from that more shallow motion. And sometimes it could be, let's say, shallow motions are better. Same with the lunge or split squat exercise I quite like, where one foot is ahead of the other, and you're lowering the back knee to the floor. Instead of lowering the back knee to the floor, you lower it down to maybe I tend to use Pilates blocks in the gym or in the clinic, but something that is going to stop you from going all the way down. That's less likely to be problematic for the hip anyway. It's probably more the deadlift motion that might be. But again, if you're not confident with those exercises, then it might be some of the fixed machines guide you in a better movement as well, so you're less likely to kind of cause any problems there. But yeah, they're the big ones there. But it sounds like you're doing great, and it's the fact you've got down from 114 kilograms to 77 kilograms is amazing. So yeah, it's great, and feel free to kind of give any more context there of if there's any particular exercises you are struggling with or any that cause any problems, and I can elaborate on that after the next question. So have I got this one? Yep, sorry, done that one. So the next question was, I have bulging discs in my lower back. What are the best exercises for me? So with this one, and again, I haven't had any more information from this person on if they're in any pain, how long the pain's been there, if they've had an MRI, if have they had an MRI to tell them that they've got bulging discs, or is it just someone they've seen thinks they might have a bulging disc. So you don't know any of the symptoms. So I'm just going to give a little bit of what might be an interesting take on bulging discs and the approach that I tend to take and the mistakes I see a lot of people make. So for this, I'm just going to bring in this table. So for anyone who's listening on audio, I've just brought in a table that it lists common findings of MRI findings for the lower back. So it talks about disc degeneration, this disc bulge, disc protrusion, which is commonly referred to as a slip disc. They're kind of the three that you sort of see the most. And it then has broken it down into 20s, people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Now, what they did in this study, they took a load of people who've never had back pain in their life, or never sort of significant episode of back pain in their life, and put them through an MRI scanner and say they've found all those common findings. And in each decade of life, they've given the percentage of people that showed or had any of these things. So the ones we're looking at is disc bulge, primarily from this question. But if we look at the people in their 20s, 30% of people had a disc bulge. And remember, these are people who have not had any kind of episode of back pain before. So these disc bulges are not associated with pain in any way or form. If we jump up to someone in their 60s, 69% of people had a disc bulge that they didn't know they had. And why this is kind of relevant is sometimes if you are in your 60s, you experience some back pain, and then you eventually go on to get a scan. The back pain may or may not be relevant to the disc bulge. That you might have been someone who had a disc bulge all the way through, and actually the back pain is coming from something else. But because you're now in pain, you now find out you've got a disc bulge. The automatic assumption is the pain is coming from the disc bulge. And we then become very fearful around our back and don't want to move in case we cause another problem. And we often then start doing less. And because we're doing less, the back gets weaker and they're actually more prone to a problem than actually if we push through. The other reason I like to show this table to a lot of my patients in the clinic is it just shows that even if the disc bulge is the source of the pain, it's completely feasible. You can still have that disc bulge and not be in pain. So it's a bit like the hip arthritis I talked about earlier. It's because you've got disc bulge or because you had hip arthritis, you're more likely to have pain or discomfort or symptoms from it than someone who doesn't have a disc bulge or doesn't have hip arthritis. But it's completely feasible. You can, once it's flared up, it can still calm down and then go back to being pain-free again or very minimal pain. Other one it's worth noting in there is disc protrusion. So that idea of this slip disc, and just to clarify what the disc protrusion actually means is the intervertebral discs. So you've got the bones of the spine and then you've got these intervertebral discs in between each vertebra. They have a kind of rubbery outer layer with more of a slightly more fluid layer inside. Someone quite nicely referred to this. It's a bit like a car tire filled with chewing gum. And sometimes it's the chewing gum effectively gets pushed through the wall of the tire and comes out. And that's what when someone refers to a slip disc, that's what they mean, is that fluid is just slightly come out of the disc or that rubbery substance. What it's not is the discs or bones slipping on each other, which when we create that vision in our mind, it makes us feel really terrified of our back. It makes our back feel very vulnerable and we tend to do a lot less. Sometimes just understanding what slip disc is can be really helpful. But again, in those slip discs or that disc protrusion in their 20s, 29% of people had one that they never knew they had. So again, people often hear that they've got one and it's this terrible news that they're going to need surgery, and actually, same thing, it can calm down and it can go back to being pain-free without an issue. And again, if we jump up to people in their 60s, it's 38% of people have got one they never knew they had. So it's not quite as sharp a rise as the disc bulges, but again, worth noting in there. So for someone who has bulging discs in their back, it comes back to the symptoms you experience with it, to what exercise is going to help you most, or which ones to potentially avoid for that particular period of time until it calms down, and then we want to add them back in again. But again, the mistake I see a lot of people make is a bit like with the people who tweak their backs during the deadlift, is people with bulging discs in their back feel like a deadlift is going to be the worst thing in the world for it. So they tend to avoid doing any type of exercise or any deadlift type motion because of the fear of the back. So they're now missing this big major movement pattern that we need on a day-to-day basis, or not necessarily day-to-day, but you might need, let's say, when you're moving that plant pot or the suitcase into the boot of the car, and if you haven't prepared your body for it, it's more likely to then cause a problem, particularly as you've got something that's not 100% in the back anyway. So what I would say is the best exercise to introduce is the one you're probably fearful of, which is some form of hip hinge based exercise, which will look like a deadlift. Could be bridge is a nice way of starting, or hip thrust exercise, where you the bridge is where you lay on your floor with your knees bent and you lift your hips up into the air and back down again. So you're extending the hips and lowering them back down so the hips are hinging. You could do that with a weight across you, whether it's a dumbbell, or you can do a bar over you and lift the weight up. And people tend to feel a bit more confident doing that than they do doing a deadlift to start with. Hip thruster takes that a bit further, where your shoulders or you supported on the bench, and you're still doing the same movement where you lower your hips down towards the floor, but because your shoulders are now higher than your hips, you can go through a bigger angle and lift back up again. And then you've got the remaining deadlift and the deadlift. But yeah, some form of hip hinge exercise is one that you should include rather than trying to avoid. If you're doing the full deadlifts, we might want to be a bit more conscious of your form and try not to curl your back quite as much, and make sure we're trying to keep it straighter, which is why I tend to prefer a Romanian deadlift. And that's something that, yeah, I think we want to include in there. You might also want to include some more specific exercises, things like dead bugs, which work the lower abdominals. So you're on your back, legs up in the air and your arms in the air, and you kind of sort of stretch one leg away from you and one arm away from you, but focusing on trying to keep the back straight and not letting it arch. There's a nice one in there. We might want to do some rotational work where you're pulling against a cable machine or a resistance band and you're kind of twisting around. So again, we're getting all those abdominals that are going to support that back a bit better, and we're targeting everything there. Sue's just mentioned in the chat, when I had a back issue a short while ago, my physio prescribed the deadlift as an exercise for me to do at the gym. Yeah, brilliant. Sounds like you've got good physio there, because again, sometimes we're fearful. I know when I was a lot younger, I'd be fearful to introduce a deadlift to someone who's got back pain or disc issues, in case I made it worse. But again, it goes back to start slow, do the movement with very little resistance. You can do a deadlift with a broom handle to go through the movement patterns first, check there's no adverse reactions, gradually build it up. And I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, because it's the same approach every time, is we just get confident with things first before we add the weight, and then we gradually add the weight from there. We just don't take big steps up. So hopefully that's helped. Like I said, I didn't have much more information than that in terms of what symptoms they're experiencing first. If you do have any back pain, whether you're the person that asked the question or whether it's somebody else watching and you're not sure and you are nervous about getting started, then go and see any good physio or kind of rehab professional, and they'll be able to help guide you with that and build your confidence before you kind of progress on your own. And then if you're really concerned about your back and not sure even if that's the best option, then do go and see your GP or other healthcare professional. And then I've got one more question that, I've actually got two more questions prepared. And then if anyone else has got any questions, please do include those in the chat. So this one came in, said, is there a best time of day to work out? So my take on this is very simplistic, is the best day or best time of day to work out is the day or time that you are actually going to do it. So I wouldn't focus too heavily on the very small details that might add 1% to what you're going to do. Is if you're thinking the morning might be the best time because you've read something somewhere, but you really struggle to motivate yourself in the morning, and rather than turn up 3 times a week, you're only turning up once a week because you had the best intentions but just couldn't quite get yourself to do it, then I would go with when you might do it. It might be lunchtime, might be after work. That time that is the easiest for you to actually turn up and develop a routine is the best time for you to do it. I tend to kind of think of things like they talk about the kind of the 80-20 rule, or a lot of time it's even the 90-10 rule of 80 to 90% of your gains are going to come from just turning up at some point in the day, doing 4 or 5 exercises, doing them against enough resistance to reach muscular fatigue, and you are going to get so much benefit from doing that. There's a lot of people that focus too much on the 10 to 20% of, if I do this particular exercise in this way, then I'm going to get so much benefit from there. Or if I work out a particular time, or there might be all these little subtleties they kind of focus on, and they miss the 80% along the way. And then you're just working on something that might give you a 10 or 20% gain rather than the big thing that's going to give you the 80%. And a nice analogy is, I went to a talk with a cycling coach called Dan Hunt, who was the number 2 to David Brailsford for Team Sky and GB Cycling. And he talked about, because Team Sky are known for this 1% marginal gains theory, where everything you do, every little thing might add 1% to your performance. And if we add enough 1% along the way, then you've got a 10 or 20% gain there. And that, if we compare that to another team that's not doing the small things, gives them a competitive edge. Interestingly, Dan Hunt said in his talk is, although that's a thing that the team are known for, they didn't let them change all the little things until they were winning with the equipment they had. So one of the things is the team wanted a new bike, they needed new the suits that they wear for cycling. They wanted to tweak some of the nutrition and things along those lines. And actually what they said, he wasn't going to get them any new equipment until they won a world championships with the equipment they already had. So they focused on the very basics, the things that were going to create that 80%. And then once they did that, they then added the 1% gains on the top. And again, a lot of people like to jump in straight in at, let's tweak the 1%, when I haven't it really nailed. I'm only turning up once at the most per week at the gym. I'm only doing 2 or 3 exercises. I'm not doing them at enough intensity. And actually, that's the thing you need to work on and forget, do I take a protein shake straight after, or do I need to do this or that, or let's say a specific time of day? I mean, I know the person who asked the question is working on that 80%, so they might want to refine things slightly and feel like they're taking control there. I would say, for me, not, because sometimes they talked about whether we do it fasted or whether you're better to eat. I think if you're doing strength training, I would tend to do it having eaten at some point beforehand, because you're then going to have a sort of more energy to perform the workouts with and then get more strength from. That's what I tend to do. But again, I wouldn't get too focused on it. I would just do it at the time that best fits your lifestyle and your daily routine, and go from there. So hopefully that kind of helps a little bit there. And then the last question I had was, due to a previous surgery, I have one arm that is weaker than the other. What is the best way for me to get started without kind of creating too much of an imbalance or using as an excuse for me not to do enough for the rest of the body? And they had a few questions there. So again, I don't know enough about specifically what the limitations and where the weaknesses feel within that. It was just the weak shoulder you mentioned. But there's often an argument or a discussion I have with a lot of people about, if you do have one arm that's significantly weaker or one leg that's significantly weaker than the other, when you're doing exercises, your weaker arm is going to fatigue a lot earlier than your stronger arm. So should you be using the same weight in both arms, or should you use a heavier weight in your stronger arm and a lower weight in your weaker arm? So because again, it could be that rather than doing bilateral shoulder press or chest press, you might work on just doing one arm at a time, focus on that one, and then with a different weight use this one. And then the fear that people have is, if I'm lifting heavier on one side and less on the other side, am I not just creating a strong arm, and the imbalance is basically still going to be there? Shouldn't I just hold off on the strong arm, just get the weaker arm stronger until they've met, and then work on it from there? And there's a couple of reasons why I would say, actually, I think you should be pushing each arm individually to build strength in both of them. Is, for a lot of people, if you are waiting for your weak arm to catch up to your strong arm and you're not doing anything with your strong arm's probably actually getting a bit weaker. So as your weaker arm is improving, your stronger arm is getting weaker, and then you get to a point where the left feels like it's similar to your right side. So it feels like your left is caught all the way up to your strong arm, but actually it's caught up earlier than it would have done, because actually both of them are slightly weaker than they were at the start. So I'd much rather you build a better target for your weaker arm to catch up to than try and hold your stronger arm back and actually probably result in that getting weaker. The other reason I like to work the stronger arm or stronger leg, whichever part of the body someone might be struggling with, is there's something called the cross-educational effect. So they did a study that with people that with legs, so someone that was non-weight bearing through one leg, they got them to do a heavy resistance training in the opposite leg, and they had another group of people who didn't do any training, and the people who trained their good leg and did nothing with their bad leg, they lost less strength in their bad leg than the group that didn't do any exercise at all. So there's this kind of theory that the area in the brain that controls both of those legs, if we can teach it what it should feel like to do the exercise in the correct way, we retain a lot of that signaling and that the kind of efficient use of those muscles when we start to train the other leg again. So same with the arm, is if we're teaching the brain what it should feel like to lift a much heavier weight and push the fatigue with your strong arm, that is going to carry over and help your weaker arm get stronger along the way. So yeah, it's called the cross-educational effect, that you can look up if you want to there. The person didn't say, again, how painful or symptomatic that weaker arm is, because again, we might need to change position. So I've talked about shoulder press there. If at the top when your arm is upright by your head, that is causing a lot of pain, then we might want to sit back on a bench so our arm is a slightly more open angle, or we might just work on bench press to start with, so our arm is just going in front of us. That tends to be less painful. The other thing that might affect it is if you're trying to do things like squats and hold a bar behind your back, that might be too painful for the shoulder. So you might have to do things like leg press, where it doesn't matter where your arm is or what position your arms are in. So there are ways of strengthening the rest of the body without the need for the shoulder to become painful or flared up. And we just need to modify a program. And then once you found a program of exercises that work for you, is gradually build from there. But I'd probably do the arms single arm at a time, so you can really focus on building strength in each arm individually, and I think that it will help you feel motivated seeing both of them improve, rather than feeling like the other one's a waste of time because it's not doing anything, it's not getting stronger. And if you're then holding the legs back as well by not doing anything, it's just a negative experience. So I would work on trying to push everything to the point where you can get it to fatigue, but making sure we're not flaring up anything along the way. So again, hopefully that is helpful. That is all the questions that I'd come prepared with. So if you are watching live and you've got any questions, it's the last chance to get your questions in before we finish. If you have found any value from this video, whether you're watching live or whether you're watching later on, please do give the video a like or thumbs up, and do make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because I put all the podcast episodes on the YouTube channel, and any of the live Q&As, if you click the alerts bell as well, you'll get told every time that I'm going live. But the next one it's the first Wednesday of every month at 12 o'clock. So I hadn't actually looked up when the next one will be. So that will be in July, which will be Wednesday, the 2nd of July, will be the next Q&A session. So if you've got any questions before now or before then please do email me, chris@nevertoiltolift.com, or just leave them in the comments below. Before next month, I will be checking the questions very regularly to see which ones I can include into the Q&A session. Just a quick reminder that if you are interested in getting started with strength training, but you're just a bit nervous about how to start and just want a bit more of a framework to follow, then I have the free masterclass. So it's nevertoiltolift.com/masterclass. So again, you'll get bit of the theory on how to get started, some of the exercises that you can include in a program, how you might adapt those. I'll also mention a little bit about my course, Stronger for Life, and kind of what that entails, and that might be the logical next step for some people who want a bit more support and then a bit more community from everyone else who's in there. But you'll learn a little bit more about that at the end, and there'll be an offer there for you. And then the other thing you might be interested in is the Never Toiled to Lift book, which you can find. So it's just there in the background, but you can find that on Amazon. So just search Never Toiled to Lift on Amazon, or again, if you're on YouTube, you can find the link in the description below. But I think that's it. There's no other questions come in. So for now, I hope you have a good week. We'll be back with another episode next week. And then I said the next Q&A will be on the 2nd of July. Yeah, thanks. Bye.